On the topic of illegal immigration, according to a Harvard-Harris poll that was taken earlier this month, nearly 60%, 56%, according to the poll I saw, 56% of Americans want to deport all illegal aliens, all of them. The percentage that want to deport at least criminal illegal aliens, over 3/4, close to 80%. So for Democrats to shut down the government over taxpayer subsidization of illegal alien health care, over further taxpayer subsidization of transgenderism, have you guys learned a darn thing? In some sense, the Democratic Party has a long and at times illustrious, at times less than illustrious history in these United States. The predecessor for today's Democratic Party goes all the way back to the first two-party system, the original two-party system after the birth of America. Now, at the very, very, very beginning, it was entirely obvious how America's political system would develop. James Madison, writing in the Federalist number 10, one of the most quoted of the Federalist Papers, those amazing essays written synonymously in support of the ratification of the Constitution. In Federalist number 10, James Madison famously warns of the dangers of faction, of factionalism. And it was to be the case that those concerns, while still true today, didn't necessarily stick in those early patriots' minds that much, at least to the extent that it prevented them from forming political parties. Shortly after George Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States, you had the formation of the first two-party system. You had the Federalist Party of George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and then you had what were known back then as the Democratic Republicans. This is the party of Thomas Jefferson, party of James Monroe, party ultimately of Andrew Jackson. If you know anything about today's Democratic Party, at least before the Great Awakening in the summer of 2020, you know that state and county Democratic parties all throughout the country used to hold at least Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners, the same way that state and local Republican parties hold Lincoln Day dinners. So the party really does go back, to that extent, all the way to the nation's origins. We can quibble the extent to which that founding era party is the exact same as today, but certainly at least from the Andrew Jackson presidency of the early 19th century onwards, this is the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was not always a radical vehicle. They've definitely had their major doldrums. The Democratic Party was the party of slavery. They were the party of antebellum chattel slavery. They were the party of John C. Calhoun in South Carolina, the nullification crisis, the ludicrous theory that a state could nullify federal law. They were the party of slavery, of nullification. They were the party of secession. Then they were the party of Jim Crow during the Reconstruction period as well, and well into the 20th century, for that matter. They were the party in opposition to civil rights, way up until the 20th century. But at least in the 20th century onwards, despite that incredibly complicated at best and insidious at worst history, from the 20th century onwards, the Democratic Party also started to develop a reputation as one that was focused on economic and bread and butter issues. So given all the recent headlines, the federal government shutdown of October 2025, just the fact that crazy radical leftists like AOC of New York City, Jasmine Crockett of Texas, Rashida Tlaib, the keffiyeh-clad radical up in Michigan, given the fact that they are all in the headlines these days, and given the fact this party really does show no signs of going back to the pre-2024, or as we'll see, pre-2008 status quo ante, I want to zoom out, do a deep dive here on the history of this party, Democratic Party. Andrew Jackson, as I mentioned, really even more so that you might say than a Thomas Jefferson. Andrew Jackson really is the first United States president to really identify with the modern incarnation of the Democratic Party. Prior to that, there was the old Democratic Republican Party, which, yes, was an ancestral, vestigial ancestor of the Democrats, but Jackson, in many ways, is the first semi-modern Democrat. What was Andrew Jackson? Andrew Jackson was, well, his thoughts on race were complicated, as were many Democrats of that era, but he was an economic populist. Andrew Jackson was the president who went to war against the Second Bank of the United States, which he saw as an out-of-touch tool of the coastal elite, of the cosmopolitan class, of the commerce class. He was in staunch opposition to the pro-central banking policies of men like Henry Clay and Alexander Hamilton, who preceded him. It was that strand of economic populism that proved to be very prescient and would guide the party well into the 20th century. It was Woodrow Wilson, another virulent racist. Are you starting to sense a theme here? I digress. But Woodrow Wilson, another virulent racist, someone who infamously played a Ku Klux Klan propaganda film, aired it, Birth of a Nation, the name of that film, in the White House. It was Woodrow Wilson who was the godfather of the modern administrative state, who bequeathed to America the modern bureaucracy, the modern deep state. He was a student of 19th century German philosophy and all the gobbledygook and nonsense that much of that philosophy, not all of it, much of it entailed. Hegel, being the main philosopher, comes to mind. Taking that Hegelian thought into practice, Wilson established the baseline for what is today the sprawling administrative state. They had the Civil Service Act, certainly, going back to the Reconstruction period in the late 19th century. But Wilson, staying true to those Jacksonian populist roots, implements the administrative state in the overarching context of World War I. He implements tremendous monetary policy reform with the signing of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the first attempt at a central bank of these United States since Andrew Jackson slayed the Second Bank of the United States. A century prior, the Federal Reserve this time deliberately intended to be a lender of last resort, more of a populist institution in some ways, you might say, than the old first and second banks that long preceded them. After Woodrow Wilson, you have FDR, as far as Democratic chronology is concerned. FDR rises from the ashes of the generally failed Herbert Hoover presidency. Not entirely. Historians are a little tough on Herbert Hoover, but the generally failed Herbert Hoover presidency. So FDR comes into power in 1932 at the midst of the New Deal. And boy, does he have ideas about how to run an economy and what that economy ought to be oriented towards. The entire New Deal economic agenda, the sprawling increase, the metastasis of the federal Leviathan, the entire predecessor of the modern alphabet soup of federal agencies, the very development, the policy and legal development, the notion of the so-called independent agency, of an agency that was statutorily authorized perhaps by Congress, and the president did not actually have full power to hire or fire commissioners. All of that is the brainchild of the New Deal. The National Labor Relations Board, the Federal Trade Commission, all of these agencies done in legally dubious fashion outside of the hierarchy of Article 2 of the Constitution, which controls the executive branch, done with the aim, or the ostensible aim, of trying to protect the little man, done with the ostensible purported aim of trying to increase wages and jobs for blue-collar, working-class men and women of America. Now, I disagree with the vast majority of FDR's his New Deal policies. But even for someone like myself, who disagrees with those policies, you can at least admit what the subjective intention is. They were trying, albeit extremely imperfectly, as anyone who's, among other things, read Milton Friedman's writings on the FDR New Deal economic agenda and its effects on prolonging the Great Depression itself. But however imperfectly, they were at least trying to help the working men and women of this country. Harry Truman, who replaces FDR in the final stanza of World War II in the mid-1940s, after FDR succumbs to illness following his being elected president 4 separate times. Harry Truman, from the Show Me State, Missouri, in many ways continues that populist, worker-centric, blue-collar economic agenda. He works very hard on trying to pass legislation boosting wages, boosting jobs, focused on the economic concerns of the everyday men and women of this country. Again, I'm not saying you have to agree with all of Harry Truman's domestic or foreign policy decisions. Lord knows his foreign policy decisions are controversial. Speaking here primarily about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the final blow in World War II. But from a domestic perspective, he was at least focused in his head, in his intentions. And this really was his number one focus in the domestic political agenda, was focused on helping the men and women of this country. John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, when he comes to power after the defeat of Richard Nixon in the 1960 presidential election, JFK definitely focused on economic issues on the domestic front. He was a Cold Warrior on a foreign front. Domestically, he was focused on slashing taxes. When Kennedy took office from President Eisenhower, who preceded him, the top marginal income tax rate was north of 90%. Kennedy slashed them to a level that would still be really high by today's standards. At times it was still north of 55, 60% or so. But still, he was a tax cutter. He was a tax cutter at home and a Cold Warrior abroad. Sure, he had his sexual peccadillos, something that would be a prescient forebear, perhaps, of Bill Clinton's 1990s sordid scandals. But in many ways, JFK, politically, on the policy, not on the page 6 salacious stuff, on the policy, JFK in many ways came across as what today we would recognize as a moderate Republican, as a moderate conservative, someone who understood the gravity of the Cold War abroad, sought to rein in the Cold War when it came to, admittedly, such failed things as the Cuban Missile Crisis and the way he handled that, and the Bay of Pigs invasion, more specifically, but understood the geopolitical confines of the Cold War chessboard. And he understood that America's national interest is served by containing what was then commonly referred to as the domino theory of Soviet communist neo-Marxist expansionism. Jimmy Carter, about as failed a president as it comes, in the late 1970s, still someone who again was focused primarily on populist economic issues. I abhor Jimmy Carter's presidential legacy. It is a failed legacy, a legacy of complete repudiation and failure on the domestic and the foreign stage. But what did Jimmy Carter do? He signed into law the statute authorizing the Department of Education, trying to implement greater federal control on education, the expansion of the administrative state. He was focused on all sorts of other price control and wage control experiments too. He was focused on airline industry, all sorts of stuff that he was ultimately really trying to help people on the lower rungs of the economic ladder. Again, his presidency was a failure, but he was trying. Bill Clinton in the 1990s, this is where it gets really fun. Bill Clinton, folks, probably one of the more moderate presidents of my lifetime. Now, I'm only 36 and a half years old. It's not like I've lived through that many presidents. Folks, Bill Clinton was a genuine moderate of a president. Bill Clinton repealed Glass-Steagall on an economic policy basis. This New Deal era statute that amounted to a massive financial deregulation statute. Some folks blame that for the 2008 financial crash. I think the connecting the dots there is a little spacious, but he still believed in it. Bill Clinton, who famously signed into law the Defense of Marriage Act, overturned subsequently in the 2013 Supreme Court case Windsor, but the Defense of Marriage Act, which literally did exactly that, defined marriage for federal purposes as one man and one woman. Bill Clinton, who famously says that his stance on abortion is that it should be safe, legal, and rare. How about a throwback on that one? My God. Let's go ahead and actually watch a clip of Bill Clinton in his heyday. This is the moderate Slick Willie that a lot of folks today have just totally forgotten about.
All Americans, not only in the states most heavily affected, but in every place in this country, are rightly disturbed by the large numbers of illegal aliens entering our country. The jobs they hold might otherwise be held by citizens or legal immigrants. The public service they use impose burdens on our taxpayers. That's why our administration has moved aggressively to secure our borders more, by hiring a record number of new border guards, by deporting twice as many criminal aliens as ever before, by cracking down on illegal hiring, by barring welfare benefits to illegal aliens. In the budget I will present to you, we will try to do more to speed the deportation of illegal aliens who are arrested for crimes, to better identify illegal aliens in the workplace as recommended by the commission headed by former Congresswoman Barbara Jordan. We are a nation of immigrants, but we are also a nation of laws. It is wrong and ultimately self-defeating for a nation of immigrants to permit the kind of abuse of our immigration laws we have seen in recent years, and we must do more to stop it.
Is there a single line, is there a single line that we just heard there from President Clinton? Is there a single line that the median Democrat today would still abide by? Denying welfare to illegal aliens? Democrats literally just shut down the government over that. When it comes to subsidization of illegal alien health care, extending Obamacare subsidies and Medicare to illegal aliens, Clinton himself was the work for welfare guy. Arguably the single greatest domestic achievement that he signed into law, the work to welfare reform. How about the death penalty? Following the horrific domestic terrorism act of Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing in the mid-90s, Bill Clinton signs into law a statute called EDPA, the Effective Death Penalty Act, dealing with the death penalty and terrorism and litigation, a statute that I remember all too well from my days in law school and my days as a federal law clerk. It's a good statute. It's a very good law. Did I disagree with some things that Bill Clinton did? Yeah, of course I did. The nomination of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer to the U.S. Supreme Court certainly leaped to the front of my mind. But what I would do to have Democrats like Bill Clinton today, what I would do to have Democrats who talk like that when it comes to, sure, referring to America as a nation of immigrants, I don't agree with that, America's a nation of citizens. But take that and stipulate that, and then still saying we were a nation of laws? Really? Again, you're not going to find anyone who speaks like that today. An even crazier clip. Harry Reid. You know, I was actually just recently out in Las Vegas for the first time since they renamed the international airport there from McCarran International Airport to Harry Reid International Airport. The Silver State, the state of Nevada, choosing to honor their own longtime senator, Harry Reid, who totally lost it in the latter years of his service. But go back to the Clinton era, the 1990s, Harry Reid, of all people, sounding pretty moderate, dare I say conservative, on the same issue that President Clinton was just talking about, illegal immigration. Go ahead and watch this one.
If making it easy to be an illegal alien isn't enough, how about offering a reward for being an illegal immigrant? No sane country would do that, right? Guess again. If you break our laws by entering this country without permission and give birth to a child, we reward that child with U.S. citizenship and guarantee of full access to all public and social services this society provides. And that's a lot of services. Is it any wonder that 2/3 of the babies born at taxpayer expense at county-run hospitals in Los Angeles are born to illegal alien mothers?
He's literally talking about the birthright citizenship debate. The very debate that President Trump has been pushing since the 2016 election, and that Democrats and liberals have called him a racist, fascist pig for doing so. But once upon a time, you saw the timestamp there on C-SPAN, 1993, the very beginning of the Clinton presidency, illegal immigration was out, United States citizenship was in. Once upon a time, people understood that citizenship is something to be valued and cherished, something to be earned. And you can't just come across here, especially in today's day and age of birth tourism. Trust me, here in South Florida, where I live, we see a lot of that. You see a lot of birth tourism, especially from Eastern European countries, a lot of Russian speakers, obviously to say nothing of folks coming up through the cartels and the trafficking rings through Mexico. The notion that you could come here 8 months pregnant, have your child in a hospital ward that we're literally paying for because bad law in this country mandates that we subsidize even illegal aliens' medical procedures when they show up to hospitals. The notion that you could show up 8 months pregnant, have your baby, and that baby is given citizenship is nuts. It is so nuts that, again, even Harry Reid back in the day was able to recognize that. The debate in this country for a long time was about the proper level of legal immigration. A debate, frankly, that Republicans did not actually effectively wage. All too often, there was the notion that legal immigration good, illegal immigration bad. This faux, unsustainable, moral, and political and substantive dichotomy between good and bad. Well, no, it's actually more complicated than that. Not all legal immigration is good. But that's where the debate was. The debate was not over illegal immigration. There was no debate. Everyone opposed it. If you are an American, you oppose illegal immigration for the very simple reason that if you are an American, you support this nation's laws, you support the Constitution, you support our men and women who secure and protect and preserve this great nation. From the Border Patrol to the men and women in uniform, it was not a subject of particular debate. It just wasn't. It literally was not. Go ahead a little further. Something really crazy happens to this party, Democrat Party, in the Bush era leading up to the 2008 election. Barack Obama emerges after his star-studded, critically acclaimed, universally applauded speech at the 2004 Democratic National Convention. He bursts onto the scene, and he manages to defeat Hillary Clinton in the 2008 Democratic primary. A tremendous victory for grassroots leftism, grassroots progressivism over institutional Democratic Party establishment. But what I find fascinating, which we're about to see, is that even then, even as Barack Obama was campaigning as a left-wing insurgent over the establishment Clinton, he felt the need to hide And yes, he was hiding. He was hiding his radicalism. He was not leveling with the American people as to the leftward nature of his true, sincere feelings and the presidency that he hoped to lead. For instance, here he was right around that time with Pastor Rick Warren of Saddleback Church out in California.
I believe that marriage is the union between a man and a woman. Now, for me as a Christian, it's also a sacred union. God's in the mix.
Would you support a constitutional amendment with that definition?
No, I would not.
Why not?
And because historically, we have not defined marriage in our Constitution. It's been a matter of state law. That has been our tradition.
All right, so first of all, small note, he's wrong on the law. Again, his Democratic presidential predecessor, Bill Clinton, signed DOMA, signed the Defense of Marriage Act as a federal statute. So he's literally wrong on the law, which is pretty embarrassing because Barack Obama actually was a law lecturer at my alma mater, University of Chicago Law School. So he's wrong on the law. He's also lying through his teeth. He's lying through his teeth, as anyone who knew Barack Obama around that time would have known, because he was a truly radical Saul Alinsky, Jeremiah Wright church attending leftist. Back at Chicago Law School, when he was a lecturer there for a decade, even the center-left faculty was well known to not like him. One, because he was just not particularly collegial, he had no interest in collaborating, but two, because he was really out there. He was really out there. But the fact that even Barack Obama saw a need to lie, and yes, he's lying in that clip, but he saw a need to lie to Pastor Warren of Saddleback Church back in 2008. The fact that he felt the need to do that shows where the party was. I mean, that issue, the polling just changed essentially overnight. From 2008 until the constitutionalization of same-sex marriage in the latter years of the second Obama term and the Obergefell case of 2015. Now, that really shows you how quickly a political issue can take off. But the nature of the Obama political coalition, this is really where I want to drill down. The 2008 political coalition that Barack Obama assembles, the Hope and Change Coalition, I remember it so well. I was a sophomore in college. This coalition was filled with Hispanics and blacks and white PhD liberals and young people. It was a coalition, in many ways, of aggrieved interests. It was a coalition of folks who had some sort of complaint, some bone to pick, some issue with the man, with the establishment, with the institutions, with perhaps even the country in general. And accordingly, they voted for a left-wing radical for, as the slogan was popularly known, for hope and for change. Now, the term woke was not really part of the discourse quite yet. But this was the predecessor to woke. The 2008 Barack Obama coalition is absolutely the predecessor to what today we would call the woke agenda. To this notion of an intersectional identity politics spectrum, of cobbling together a coalition of folks who don't necessarily have a whole lot in common on paper, certainly not like the old Democratic Party coalition of the old FDR, Harry Truman, even JFK or Jimmy Carter years. No. That was a coalition of, primarily, of blue-collar Americans. A lot of Midwestern and Northeast Catholics and some blue-collar Protestants as well. But no, the 2008 Barack Obama coalition totally upends that. And in so doing, it upends the very nature of a political party that for about a century before it, going back all the way to the Woodrow Wilson presidency at least, had been forged through the crucible of having a domestic focus on economic issues. After Barack Obama, the Democratic Party became obsessed, absolutely obsessed with the culture war, with waging a woke culture war against the American people on behalf of Team Civilizational Arson against Team Civilizational Sanity for the purpose of humiliating, dehumanizing, and ultimately defeating the side of Americanism. I'm not saying that the other side are not Americans. I'm saying that in a roiling culture war today, between left and right, there is only one side that cares about the notion of Americanism, of historically rooted, traditional American experience, customs, ways of life, and so forth. There's only one side of our contemporary political divide today that really cares about upholding the United States of America and the Burkean sense of a nation as a compact between the dead, the living, and the yet unborn. The dead, in this case, going back at least as far as the spilled blood of patriots during the Revolutionary War against the British. The woke intersectional identity politics coalition has no room for that whatsoever. For a little while, it worked. Barack Obama, after all, won re-election in 2012 over a highly flawed opponent, Mitt Romney, but he won re-election nonetheless. They even saw their resurgence after the contested election of 2020. Joe Biden was really peak woke. The Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Merrick Garland regime was absolutely, bar none, peak woke. It was taking the Barack Obama coalition and taking it to its logical conclusion. This is how you had a Supreme Court nominee, Ketanji Brown Jackson, who literally says that she does not know how to define a woman because she's not a scientist. No, this is not a Matt Walsh lampooning documentary film. A Supreme Court justice literally said that. This was the Biden administration, the era where parents who were up in arms at the rise of critical race theory, which is a really fancy way of just saying anti-white, anti-Asian, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish, anti-Mormon discrimination. The Garland DOJ puts out a memo in the fall of 2021 equating parents who are upset about the metastasis of critical race theory, aka anti-white racism. The memo compared them to domestic terrorists. This was an administration that mainstreamed the spread of transgenderism. Because after the constitutionalization of same-sex marriage during the Obama presidency, what was the next front going to be in the LGBTQ plus whatever letters I'm missing here, in their ceaseless attempts to remake America in their image? Transgenderism had kind of sort of become a thing in the Obama era. It was becoming a thing certainly in the Trump era. In the Biden era, it absolutely exploded. And then you look today. The Democratic Party in the midst of this shutdown fight of October 2025. What was their stance? What is the Democratic stance in the shutdown fight? Well, you'd be forgiven for not being able to provide a clear and coherent answer. It's a little unclear, honestly. But they certainly believe in extending expiring Obamacare subsidies and extending Medicare or Medicaid payments to illegal aliens. They certainly believe in taxpayer subsidization of so-called gender-affirming care, aka chemical castration and genital mutilation. The problem for the Democrats is that the polling is not on their side on these issues. A recent poll from the American Principles Project showed that upwards of 66%, roughly two-thirds of Americans, do not want their taxpayer dollars to support so-called gender-affirming care, aka genital mutilation. Roughly 80%, roughly 4/5 of Americans oppose biological males competing in women's sports. Something else the Democrats continue to pound away at. How about illegal immigration? On the topic of illegal immigration, according to a Harvard-Harris poll that was taken earlier this month, nearly 60%, 56%, according to the poll I saw, 56% of Americans want to deport all illegal aliens, all of them. The percentage that want to deport at least criminal illegal aliens, over 3/4, close to 80%. So for Democrats to shut down the government over taxpayer subsidization of illegal alien health care, over further taxpayer subsidization of transgenderism, have you guys learned a darn thing? Have you seriously learned a darn thing since the 2024 Democrat presidential election? Have you learned a darn thing since Kamala Harris got shellacked, got smoked, lost all 7 of the major swing states? Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and the 3 Rust Belt prizes of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. A prediction, by the way, which you, if you had been listening to the Josh Hammer Show at the time, you would have heard right here, right before the election. But more to the point, have they learned anything since then? Can you actually say that they have looked there and said, wow, that is something that we did wrong, and now we're acting differently? I'll tell you one Democrat who actually seems to get it. It's John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, saying exactly what I just said about how Democrats seemingly have learned nothing. Let's go ahead and watch that.
I'm the only Democrat in my family. I grew up in a conservative part of Pennsylvania, and I grew up and I know and I love people that voted for President Trump. But they are not fascists. They're not Nazis. They're not trying to destroy the Constitution and those things. And that's part of another thing. I refuse to call people Nazis or fascists, or I would never compare anybody to Hitler and those things.
So John Fetterman there at that News Nation town hall talking about how he would never use that sort of language for his political opponents, the kind of language that led to multiple assassination attempts on Donald Trump and led to the slaying of my late friend Charlie Kirk. Here's a little bit more from John Fetterman talking about how Democrats, again, have just learned nothing from losing all the swing states last November.
Well, if you're thinking about winning the election, and so now that's all going to come down to 7 or 8 states. And that's really that matters. And I would like to remind everybody, because we all know that Trump ran the table, all of those kinds of states. And now you can't ever forget, these are the states that are going to determine who's going to be the next administration. And now a lot of the things, the extremism that people turned their back in 24, and that's how we kind of came up short.
All right, so good stuff there from Senator Fetterman on News Nation, by the way, a cable news channel that I do recommend you check out for those of you who still have not cut the cord. Fetterman is one of the rare lights of Democrats, one of the rare Democrats these days who really seems to actually get it. And credit where credit is due. He stands strong when need be. Now, he still votes with his party the overwhelming majority of the time. But during the October 2025 shutdown fight this month, he has taken some tough votes from his party's perspective. And he's going to probably reap what he sowed. He's looking at a potentially really difficult senatorial primary come 2028, when his term is up. But Fetterman is someone who is not obsessed with the intersectional woke culture war of the modern Democratic Party. He is not someone who is obsessed with trying to open the floodgates of this nation's borders and release all sorts of criminal aliens into the interior. He's not someone who is obsessed with the latest faddish type of sexual ideology. He's not someone who is obsessed with pursuing the rainbow agenda at the expense of believers. He is someone who is interested as his party once upon a time was, in the economy, in having a decently stable America. Something that JFK, John F. Kennedy, certainly believed in when it came to the threat of the Soviet Union back in the early 1960s. Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese military strategist, lived about 2.5 millennia ago. Sun Tzu famously said that a battle is won before it is fought, because it is won by choosing the terrain on which that battle is fought. One of Donald Trump's greatest skills, one of his greatest assets as a politician, is that he has a keen, shrewd instinct for framing the political terrain so as to make his political opponents defend the indefensible. Call it, as I have done in the past, the art of the 80-20 issue. But boy, are Democrats making Donald Trump's job easier than ever. All this talk about men and women's sports, all this talk about how if you don't want to subsidize genital mutilation, how you're a transphobe, all this talk, as we saw from the mayor of Dearborn, Michigan, a month or two ago, all this talk about how if you don't want to rename a street after a dead Hezbollah jihadi, then you are an Islamophobe. All this talk, how if you support, as Bill Clinton did in the 90s, how Harry Reid did in the 90s, all this talk how if you don't support enforcing this nation's immigration laws, how you are a xenophobe. Guys, enough of the phobes. No one's buying it. No one cares. No one takes you seriously when you cry wolf like that. If Democrats have any interest in restoring themselves to a point of political relevance, let alone majority status, in our present political environment, they're going to have to ditch that 2008 coalition. They're going to have to ditch the intersectional woke culture war that has already paid Republicans such heavy dividends, leading to the statistical toss-up in the 2024 presidential election of demographic subgroups like Hispanic men. Democrats, in short, need less Jasmine Crockett, less AOC, and a lot more John Fetterman. Can they do it? I don't know. The early signs from this first year after the presidential election last year are not exactly promising. Personally, as someone who wishes the Democratic Party nothing but the worst from a political perspective, I'm not entirely sure I particularly care. But you would think, at some point, they will come to their senses and do this out of their own rational self-preservation, if nothing else. Again, you would think. But ultimately, who knows? Folks, make sure to subscribe to The Josh Hammer Show if you have not already done so. Go ahead and leave us that review. We look forward to your comments. For now, I'm Josh Hammer, and we'll be right back tomorrow.